Welcome to Influenced, a book lovers podcast hosted by book besties Tegan and Amanda.
Here at Influenced, we cover books we've been influenced to read thanks to the internet, as well as books that have influenced us.
This podcast will talk about books ranging in age demographics, including adult content. Plus, we've been known to swear a time or two, so keep that in mind in case you have others around you. With that said, we are so happy you're here.
We were influenced to read The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, which was independently published in 2022. The audiobook is 15 hours and 4 minutes at normal speed. And this book has gained a lot of attention and notoriety for being independently published. It's currently in the top 100 in the Kindle store, which is quite impressive.
I was also very impressed when we were researching this episode that it was an independently published book and the traction and notoriety that it's gotten in the social community. You don't see that very often. And I think despite how this episode may go today, I think that is a good thing that we can touch on here. This book is part of a planned 6-book series, and it also has 2 standalone books right now. The duology of this first character is done, with the other 4 books to be determined as to what they are going to look like. We do know that book 3 will take place with another character's perspective, but as for timeline of when those are and what that is going to look like, that is still yet to be announced. If you haven't read The Serpent and the Wings of Night yet, no worries. We are going to start off with a spoiler-free overview, and we will give you fair warning when we are about to dive into spoiler content.
This book is a dark fantasy romance about vampires, and it is told from the first-person perspective, exclusively from the main character's point of view. Her name is Aureia, and she has been raised by vampires since she was a small child. She was rescued by Vincent, who is the king of the House of Night, and he is a Hiage vampire. Hiage is one of 2 different lines of vampires in this book. There's a long history of war and power struggle between the 2 lines of vampires, the Hiage and the Rishon. And most of this book is about Aureia competing in a competition that happens once a century called the Kajari. It's a ruthless competition to gain a wish from the goddess Nyaxia, and she is competing in this by her father's wishes because he wants her to ask Nyaxia to become his Coriate, which would transform her into a vampire without any of the risks associated with turning, like 2 out of 3 turnings resulting in death, and would also allow her and Vincent to share power with each other. So during this competition, she meets Rain, a Rishon vampire, who is a natural enemy to the Hiage line, and through a tentative alliance with this rival, Aureia must overcome obstacles and danger to win Nyaxia's favor. So some of the themes or tropes that are prevalent throughout this novel are grumpy versus sunshine, but the female main character is the grumpy one here. Also, he gives her a nickname, lack of trust, not communicating feelings, and also sort of coming of age.
It's time for us to give our ratings of this book. You might be wondering how we rate our reads, so we're happy to clarify that because everybody has a little bit different of a rating system. Tegan and I both have a similar rating with our star format. If it's 5 stars, it was an amazing book that we would absolutely reread again, and the only complaints that we have are minor criticisms that are probably personal preference. A 4-star means that we enjoyed it, but there were some minor issues worthy of a deduction. 3 stars mean it was an enjoyable book, but we had some criticisms. If we give it 2 stars, we really didn't like the book. There are glaring issues both with plot and characters, and finally, you'll never hear a 1-star review on here because if it's that low, we probably didn't finish it. So Tegan, this is going to be a different episode than we have previously done in the past. Here we go. What was your rating?
I rated this one 2 stars. Honestly, if it weren't for us discussing it on this podcast, I probably wouldn't have finished it.
Just dive right into why you didn't like.
I do want to start out by complimenting what I thought this book did well. What I did like about it was this parallel between Nyaxia's history and the challenges in the tournament. I thought that was well done. I also really liked the interlude chapters. They had a completely different writing style, and I enjoyed the writing style of those chapters more than I enjoyed the writing style of the book overall. With that said, what I thought was lacking in this book, it just fell flat in a lot of ways. The world building was not set up or explained well. I didn't connect with the writing style. I thought the characters were unrelatable. And in my opinion, the character motivations just weren't convincing.
Yep. I also really enjoyed those interlude chapters as well. I do feel like the writing style was a little different there. It gave more background that I found interesting and more engaging than the main storyline. I'm curious, is there any elements that you thought maybe contributed to it being kind of lackluster?
Yeah, the way that it was written made it feel more young adult, more YA to me, but with adult content. Up until chapter 38, if you know, you know. And in my opinion, I think this book may be more successful as a YA, just taking out some of that adult content, some of the, graphic descriptions, and just make it a YA book.
I think that's a fair assessment right there. It did feel YA, right? It kind of has a parallel to the Hunger Games and Twilight, so I think it was trying to be a more adult version that is a combination of the two, but maybe it's just because as readers, we know those books and it does parallel with them so closely that it just felt off.
I think you're spot on there. The other thing I'm curious about is if I would have liked this more if it was second person perspective. I found myself in a lot of areas of this book feeling like I wanted less of Araya's thoughts. Like I wanted to be less in her head and more observing what was going on with other people and what was going on in the world.
Right? I have found that fantasy stories with very complicated magic systems or political structures do better with a second person point of view because it helps explain the world in different ways and from different perspectives versus one person's perspective that probably has biases or only one single experience and doesn't explain the worlds nearly vast enough for the reader.
Yes, either that or switching between different characters' perspectives throughout.
I initially would have given this a 3 to 4. Probably around 3.5 is what I really went for. I found myself struggling to stay engaged at the beginning, but then the end had twists and turns that I wasn't, not that I wasn't necessarily prepared for, but that I found myself engaged and invested in going about. Were they good? I don't think so, but I still found myself compelled as a reader, so I bumped it up. Now, as I've broken these chapters apart and tried to analyze them a little further, I 3 might be generous, right? It really might be in that 2.5 range. But I also tell myself that when I read this book, I had just come off of reading A Flesh in the Fire by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I know there's a lot of people out here that may really love that series, but that one was a 2-star read for me, and this one felt a little better than that even, so it might have been my previous reading experience that helped me rate this a little higher. I would say if you're an all vibes reader, you aren't going to go analyze the plot, you're just there to enjoy a storyline, you'll probably like this book. So Tegan, I assume you're not going to continue reading on with this series.
No, there is one question that I have burning in my mind that we'll talk about when we're in our spoiler section. I really want to know the answer to that. Not enough to read the series, but when it's completed, I might do a little digging on the internet and see if I can find the answer.
Well, I have read book 2. I did decide to continue on and read it, and I would say that if you did not like book 1, you will especially not like book 2. I liked it even less, though.
Oh
And I feel
no.
bad saying that, but it just, you know what? There are books for everybody. There are people on the internet that will tell you this book is phenomenal, one of their favorite reads of the year, and love the second book even more. And you know what? Just because our opinion is not the most positive one regarding this, that does not mean you will not enjoy this.
I've honestly heard nothing but good things about this book, so I was very surprised at how much I lacked a connection with the material and, like you said, struggled to stay engaged while I was reading it. So, just because this book wasn't for us doesn't mean it's not for you. We do have some similar reading recommendations, including Twilight by Stephanie Meyer about vampires, young adult fantasy. Also, Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, particularly if you like that only one winner to the death kind of competition. From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout, also a vampire, although that one is more new adult. And lastly, the Kate Daniel series by Alana Andrews. This one is an urban fantasy that also has questionable parenting and a badass female main character.
I have read all of the Kate Daniels books. Well, except for the new ones that have recently come out. That was a pleasant surprise. I will say those are fun, easily digestible books that are just a good time to read, and I think have that kind of all vibes, no thoughts feel to it as well, but in a good way. So, sometimes we throw this section in our spoiler-free content, and sometimes we give it in our spoiler content depending on what we said. So for this one, we did throw it in our spoiler-free because we do feel like what we have to describe are just fine for this area, and that is our characters in 3 words. So Tegan, how did you describe Aurea, our female main lead, in 3 words?
Feisty, cynical, and untrusting.
Those seem like very good words to describe her, and maybe better than what I wrote. I wrote kind, skeptical, and bland. This, I think that's one of my main criticisms about the book is the characters are just a little bland, and I just would have loved more.
Yeah.
So, what about Rain?
For Rain, I put tough, apathetic, and manipulative.
Yeah, he is. I wrote secretive, gray, because he is morally gray, and also bland. Now, we're not describing Misha in this, who is a side character in this series. I would have had much more positive things to say about her than our 2 main characters.
I did like Misha's character
She
quite a
probably
bit.
was the saving grace of this book. All right, so this is the part of our journey together where we do a more deep dive into our story. So if you have not read The Serpent and the Wings of Night, this is your spoiler warning. Stop now if you do not want the ending spoiled. If you don't mind spoilers, by all means, join us further.
So, from what you've said and from those character descriptions, it sounds like you found this book pretty lackluster. Were there any scenes that you enjoyed?
There's one aspect that I did very much enjoy about this book and probably helped rate it higher for me, and that was the tentative alliance between Aurea and Rain, particularly when their tentative alliance has kind of come to an end. They don't really need each other anymore, but they just kind of avoid killing each other or addressing it because they've gotten close and continue to get closer to each other. And I really enjoyed that aspect. I do feel like the writing there was stronger. You could feel that in the characters. But there were too many things that I didn't enjoy. But before I go into that, let's hear what you liked about it. Because I do want us to highlight the things that we did enjoy about this book.
Well, you know I'm a sucker for a good sex scene. So I did enjoy that moment. Up until Araya wanted to taste her own blood on Rain's lips.
Agreed.
Immediate turn off that gave me the ick.
Uh-huh.
But I agree with what you were saying about their alliance and how they continued to have an interest in each other even though their partnership was over.
I also liked his love of the shitty beer at the bar type of thing.
Yeah.
That was really funny. There were some good small moments, but I think there were just some big concepts that struggled. One being Araya was initially stolen from her home by her father, and she was essentially locked away most of her childhood and really contained. But she is so trusting of Vincent, despite the way he rules his kingdom, despite everything he's done for her. And I'm okay with the element of this rocky relationship and there being some good things there, but I feel like all of the bad really outweighed the tiny, tiny bit of good that Vincent had. And I just found myself irritated with Araya for being so trusting and so loving to Vincent. Then we'll talk about this further when we talk about the ending, but then I had some issues specifically with the ending wish and some dialogue that happened at the ending.
There were some elements in this book that made it feel like a poorly planned D&D campaign to me. Like if the dungeon master exclusively planned fight encounters, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of violence, but not a lot of exploration or seeing different dynamics between characters other than what you mentioned before about Rain and Araya.
I gave Vincent a lot of shit, and I will continue to do so throughout this episode. I'm curious what your perspective on Vincent was and if you thought he was worthy of Araya's sympathy.
In my opinion, Vincent was a very morally gray character. There's a lot we don't know about him, and we do know he's done a lot of bad things to protect his position of power. Throughout the book, Araya does witness this struggle between Vincent the king and Vincent the father. It's really unclear why he never told Araya he was her biological father. It's also unclear what his true motivations were for having Araya compete in this competition to try to earn the Corade bonds. Was he just using her to try to get access to her power? Or was this genuinely an effort to protect her? And those are things that might be answered in later books. I just feel like there was not enough content, not enough description here to be invested one way or the other.
I found myself so irritated with him when I was reading the book. I would have really liked more information about him being her biological father from the beginning rather than it be this twist at the end, because of the element of them killing their offspring because of power. I think that would have made a much more complicated dynamic rather than him being this morally gray tyrant from the beginning. I think that gray would have come out a little bit more rather than him just maybe having this little smidge of good in him and you're only taking it from Araya's point of view and her trust in him.
It would have been cool if we had even just one chapter from Vincent's point of view at the beginning, revealing that he was actually her biological father, even if Araya didn't know that until later on. I think
Right?
that would have helped the story a lot.
Having that revelation at the beginning would have made more sense as to why Araya trusted him so explicitly and believed in him despite how terrible he was and what all he did to her and forcing her into this tournament. With that twist at the end, it just felt almost like it was thrown in there to justify her being the heir. I will say we get more of that in book 2 about the other side of him in a kind of a weird way, and I won't spoil that here. I personally didn't like the way it was done, but other people might. I think that would have been a more interesting secret for her and her father to keep away from everybody as to why he doesn't kill her. So, because we don't have these answers, you go through the book just with a lot of assumptions and guesses without a lot of support to form a really good opinion about what this is.
Although it was explained that vampires will kill anyone who is a threat, including killing their own parents or killing their children in order to maintain their power status. What are your thoughts on this? And why do you think Vincent didn't kill Araya?
So, I think we're led to believe that there is this kernel of good in Vincent, and that's ultimately why he doesn't kill Araya. But I mean, ultimately, he cares about himself more, and we see that in the way that he rules and his plans for her. I felt like the premise of killing your own children or parents for power was a little thin of a stretch for me, unless they are a political house or have some sort of political power. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why this would even be a situation for any of them.
That is a good point. And I guess in this situation between Vincent and Araya, if Araya didn't know she was an heir, then she wouldn't think to kill Vincent in order to gain that power. So therefore, she wasn't a threat to him.
Right. And maybe
Right.
that's why he kept it a secret from her, because he was worried that she would try to kill him, but because he loved her, he decided to keep her in the dark. I just felt like the justifications and reasoning behind it, while they're there, they just feel thin.
That is a really good point because, like you're saying, if this is only happening between royalty, there are three different houses in here. So, how often is this actually happening?
And the political structure of this world, the three houses, the turned versus born, it was a really good premise. I liked the premise of it once I finally kind of had a grasp on the political structure, but it was really confusing. Were you confused by this as much as I was?
I was really confused about it, yes. I had to look it up to get a better understanding of it. I wish there had been some sort of hierarchy map or something at the beginning of the book to explain how the world was structured.
Yes, that would have been so, so helpful. When authors create a fantasy world, there's an obligation to explain it and to build up their world within the story. And I do feel like the author here tried to do it very organically, which can be nice as a reader not to feel like, oh, you're just being thrown all of this information in one go and it feels kind of forced. So I do think she was trying to maybe give it to us organically, but almost too organically where it lacked the explanations behind them. Another thing I felt like maybe didn't get explained in book one, and maybe somebody can correct us if we miss this, was the Hiaj versus Rishon factions. We know that happens in the House of Night, but didn't get much explanation about, is this a race of vampires? Is it just kind of status classification? What is the line difference there? And do they fall in the other houses too?
That is another thing that I had to look up, and I learned that the Hiaj vampires are bat winged and the Rishon vampires are feather winged.
Oh,
So
yes, that's
that's
right.
the main distinction between them, but I don't think it was explained in this book whether they are part of the other factions or if those other house factions have different types of vampires.
Right, because we know the House of Blood has been cursed, and there's a backstory there that we don't know a whole lot about, but we're dealing with a whole race subset of vampires that exist only in one house, and they haven't bled into other ones, and it just seems a little hard to believe or just a little underdeveloped.
hmm Another thing that I may have missed was why is Araya called a serpent, or sometimes she's called a viper? Was that explained?
I think it leaned more into the very beginning when Vincent rescues her from her home and she bites him.
Okay.
I think that is the only reference to that that makes sense. And then my guess is he continues to call her that because she can be a little feisty, like you described her. And ultimately, he kind of raises her to be ruthless and deadly. So I think he just continues that nickname that way. One thing that was also thin, and I say this almost every episode because we had a lot of books with gods, but I would have liked more about these gods, right? Misha prays to Nyaxia's arch emesis, Atroxus, and she's left essentially high and dry by him. And we're kind of learning that these gods are finicky and have a background and have a story, but we end up really not getting a lot about it. And I was a little frustrated by it.
When we did learn that Misha prayed to Atroxus, it was also hinted that perhaps Araya's power came from Atroxus before she found out that she's half vampire. So I'm curious if that was just thrown in to give us an alternate explanation for her power until we learned the truth about her being half vampire.
It may have been. And I feel like that was maybe just a red herring in that situation. It would be cool though if that was a big setup for something bigger going forward, but I don't know if it is.
I thought we got a decent chunk of history about Nyaxia and what she went through, but the other gods we didn't learn very much about.
And it may be a little premature to say that that is a major criticism because we are looking at a 6-book series, and it would not be surprising that the gods are revealed in their story and backgrounds a little later in this journey. I just hope it's not like a From Blood and Ash situation where it takes forever to get to the main villain, I guess you would say. This could be a personal preference, but that is the main criticism I have with stories that are drawn out. They have this initial beginning plot with a villain, but you realize there's actually a bigger picture going on and it's never really hinted at, and then it changes the whole direction. And it's like, well, that would have been nice to know to at least have it hinted at and weaved in from the beginning. And I don't know if that's going to happen here, but I hope it does.
Although, even with that in mind, typically a book series that is 5 or 6 books in length, the expectation is that that first book is going to set up the world. It's primarily world building and exposition. And I don't feel like we got that here, so I'm curious how much of that will bleed into future books.
Then I'm really glad you haven't read book 2 because that was also a very interesting one. I'll just leave it at that here.
Sounds good. So during the tournament, Araya sort of forms this alliance with Rain and Misha, who is Rain's friends. They entered the tournament together. And Rain told Araya that it was Misha's idea to enter the tournament, and he didn't want her to do it alone, so he followed her into the tournament. Obviously, he had his motivations to be there, which we see at the end of the book. And he tells Araya that he crafted his words very carefully, but he never lied to her. So I'm curious what your thoughts are here. Do you think this is an instance where maybe he did truly lie to her, or was this potentially a plot hole? What do you think?
I leaned into the trope of yes, he carefully crafted his words and he never lied to her because that is a theme that I think we see in other books too that are enemies to lovers, romantasy styled genres is I've never lied to you, but you omitted things on purpose to craft it to be the truth. And that's where I leaned into when I read this. Now, I will say I have read book 2 and that this is explained further in book 2, and you will get an answer there for anyone who has that wonder, but I won't spoil it for you here.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to have you tell me about that off screen.
Will do.
So, while we're on the topic of Rain, let's talk about him a little bit more. Did you think he was a likable character?
I wanted to like him. I was all on the Rain train prior to the ending. And then it just felt disheartening and irritating at the end when he kills Vincent. I get why he killed Vincent. I'm not saying that that was the wrong choice, but he just spent all of this time getting to know Araya and falling in love with her, having her kill him. That this bond is apparently supposed to be this unshakable, beautiful thing, and then he goes and kills her father? I get it. I get he needed to kill him, but I just think that in that instance, his relationship to Araya, he acts like is one of the biggest things he has, so why not take him hostage? Why not strip him of a title? Like, why use that situation in that way when I feel like there just could have been some other alternatives that actually could have created some interesting struggles going forward in book 2?
I had the same thing in my notes. Like, why couldn't he imprison Vincent instead of killing him? I didn't expect Rain to kill Vincent, but I wasn't surprised by it because there's a part in the book when Araya said that usually after this tournament, the ruler of the House of Night would kill the Kajari winner because anyone that strong is clearly a threat. So it was either Vincent or Rain who was going to die in this situation. But as a reader, I thought it was merciless considering his relationship with Araya. And if not imprisonment, then why couldn't he at least give Araya the chance to say goodbye?
Yeah, absolutely. I just feel like it could have been done a little more mercifully and a little less heartless. Um, I do understand, and this is a context from book 2, but I do feel like it helps here. His Rishon alliance is tentative and is turbulent, and he had to kill Vincent, and it was a show of strength that there was basically no out for him in that way. But one thing we see in romantic books is putting your love above all else. And this is just that situation where it tests that, and he failed. He failed that epically. He did not put Araya first in that situation, and I just didn't like it.
Right. It made him less trustworthy to Araya. Who knows if she'll ever trust him again? But it did make him appear more powerful in everyone else's eyes.
Another big ick I had in this situation about Rain was his lying line about, I'm going to take Araya hostage, I'm going to marry her, rape her, and torture her, essentially. I hated that. It made me so mad because, again, this is a trope you see in other romantasy books. When they are done well, it usually is a test of that betrayer character. It shows that they are good at their core and that they can be trustworthy. Typically, it's done in a way where that character is saying, don't touch this person, they're mine, they will take care of the situation, but they're not saying, I'm going to hurt them, I'm going to do these things. They're still being truthful, whereas he in this situation just gave me the heebie-jeebies, and my perception of Rain in that moment was not a good one, even if he was lying.
Yeah, he's basically saying he's going to take her to be his slave, which is really interesting considering that that was his own background, right? I don't know. Through most of the book, for the most part, he was likable, in my opinion. He was protective of Araya. He was empathetic to what she was going through. He tried to do the right thing by her. But clearly he has a dark side too. And it really showed in that situation and how he handled himself after winning the tournament.
I have read book 2, as I've mentioned before, so I know what's in store for our characters here. But Tegan, I would love to hear your theories about what you think is going to happen in book 2.
I don't know about book 2 specifically, so I'll just talk about it more as a series. Unfortunately, I think Araya will forgive Rain. I do think both of them have a soft spot for humanity, that we kind of see that in book 1. So my headcanon is that the two of them are going to work together to try to create peace between the two vampiric lines and try to save humanity in the process. My burning question, though, the one I mentioned in the intro, this is the one thing that excites me and I want to know the answer about, is if they have a child, would it be a Hiaj heir or would it be a Rishon heir? And maybe that depends on which parent dies first, right? Because you become an heir, you get the heir mark when the person in power dies. So Araya is a Hiaj heir. So if she were the first one to die, then their child would probably be a Hiaj heir. I don't know. That's just my thought. I don't even know if they're going to have a child. But if they did, that's my question.
I like that question. I actually have had the same question. And my theories as a series going forward, because the series is not done, the big overarching issues are still happening even after book 2, is if they have a child together, my guess is they're going to somehow like unite these races together, and essentially there will only be one heir no matter what.
Ooh, I can see that.
Yeah, that's my guess.
You might be right about that.
So even though we don't plan to continue with this series, we're busy, we have to just read what we enjoy and what we want to. I do think that there have been some nuggets in here that are worthwhile. I think it's an interesting premise. I think it's a cool political structure, and I think it has a lot of promise that it could going forward, and that the criticisms that we have are just more of an execution problem. So, with the future books for future readers, what are things that you hope this author can improve upon to help really bring it together? Because I will say, I have heard that the standalone books in this series are great.
A lot of the character interactions that we get in this book are heavily dialogue based or stating that something happened off scene, but not actually showing what that looked like, right? I'm thinking of when Araya and Rain were training together. It was stated multiple times, oh, we've been training. We've been training for 4 days. We've been training for 5 days. And now we've been training for weeks. But we don't get one scene of what that training looks like for them. So I think finding a better balance between dialogue and description would be really good. And also giving us more of those intimate off-scene moments and bringing those into the book, letting us understand what our characters are actually experiencing and going through. The only scenes that I felt were described in that way were these violent encounters that were oftentimes kind of graphic. And the other thing I feel like there's room for improvement is just more thorough world building and explanations.
I 100% agree with you there. I wrote down I want more cohesive and a better built foundation, because I think that the premise is there and I think it could be much stronger than it is currently. Now, book 3 is assumed to be Misha's story in the way that it ends with book 2, and I'm excited to hear other people's thoughts about that, because maybe it might change my mind about continuing on with this series. I think that character is a more relatable character for many readers and could bring a different, refreshing perspective to this series. I would love to see more clear motivations from these characters in the books going forward, and why they make the decisions that they make when they might have multiple options on the table. And Honestly, I'd like to see her bring in the gods a little bit more. They're ultimately the catalyst to a lot of the things happening in this world, and they are hinted at, and I think it is time to bring them in.
Well, that is all we have for our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts on The Serpent and the Wings of Night. If you would like to connect with us, please consider following us on TikTok and Instagram. We are at Influenced Book Podcast on both platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate us wherever you get your podcast.
We look forward to our next episode when we will be discussing The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Until next time, happy reading!